Some people have criticized my portrayal of postmodernism. In what ways would you claim you are fair or unfair in your assessment of its core principles? I think I'm unfair in that any rather truncated criticism of a large body of thought is liable to clip a few corners. But I would say that I'm attempting to provide a snapshot, a relatively accurate but low resolution snapshot of a certain kind of a war of ideas that's currently going on in our culture, and that's primarily centered in the universities. And I don't think my assessment of postmodernism and its relationship with neo-Marxism is unfair in the least. In fact, I think that the danger that's presented by that combination of ideological presumptions is more dangerous than people are currently aware of, and that it poses a larger threat to the integrity of our culture than I've currently stated. It's more widespread than I thought. For example, when I first started speaking out against postmodernism and neo-Marxism, I didn't realize, for example, that the law schools had turned into training grounds for social justice activists. I didn't realize that the legal training system had become corrupt, perhaps not to the same degree as, say, the faculties of education or social work, but it's certainly a long ways down that road. And so I do believe that postmodernism is an intellectually bankrupt school of thought, and I believe that its alliance with neo-Marxism borders on malevolent, and it may even go past the border into actual malevolence, because I don't understand how anybody with an inkling of historical sense can take a look at the 20th century and then dare put forward ideas that are derived from Marxism as a treatment for any of society's hypothetical disorders. And it's not to say that I don't believe that there are errors in Western culture, say, for whatever that's worth. I mean, individuals make moral errors all the time, and groups make moral errors, and cultures make moral errors. That isn't the issue. The issue is, how are we doing compared to any reasonable alternatives? What makes you think that it's appropriate to compare the performance of Western societies, for example, to some hypothetical utopia of your own fictional imagining, especially when we've seen what sort of utopias have emerged out of such imaginings? And what is it that you are offering people as a concrete alternative? And all I see in postmodernism is destruction and nihilism, and all I see in neo-Marxism is historical ignorance, malevolence, and misdiagnosis, well, and ingratitude and arrogance. I mean, the list goes on and on. So I don't feel that I've misrepresented the postmodernists in the least, and I regard, like, I've read a fair bit of Foucault, less of Derrida, but enough to get a pretty good sense of what he's on about. Like, Foucault is readable, but more or less obvious as far as I'm concerned, and so he's a third-rate thinker, and Derrida is just a troublemaker as far as I'm concerned, although a very brilliant one. And the idea that the postmodernists had, that there's an infinite number of ways of interpreting any set of data, let's say, that actually happens to be a true observation, and a very problematic one, which is partly why it's so difficult, for example, to evolve a system that can visually perceive the world, and why about half our brain is devoted towards that. It's definitely the case that coming up with a viable interpretation of the world is a very difficult process, but that's about as far as the validity of the postmodernist claims go. After that, it's like, well, yes, there's a very large number of potential interpretations of the world, but there's a very small number of actually viable interpretations, and that's really what's relevant. And viability is constrained by all sorts of what would you call them? Well, let's call them constraints. Yes, you have to interpret the world in a manner that's commensurate with the minimization of your own intolerable suffering. That puts very tight constraints on which interpretations you're allowed to bring forward. You have to do that in a manner that's iterable and repeatable across time. You have to do that in a way that isn't too objectionable to other people, or even better, in a manner that makes them want to cooperate and compete with you, so that, you know, a rising tide lifts all boats. There's immense constraints on organizing your perceptions in a manner that is simultaneously, individually, and socially highly functional. And the postmodernists just don't grapple with that at all. They and they're biologically ignorant beyond belief and proud of that fact. And anyways, as you can tell, I can hardly say enough things that aren't good about postmodern neo-Marxists. There's apart from the fact that they got the initial observation right, which is that there's almost an infinite number of ways of interpreting a finite set of data. Everything else they've done is not only intellectually bankrupt, it's also morally reprehensible. And I think they're corrupting our culture, and I think they're hurting young people, and they're hurting them as well by getting them to pay for being hurt, which is really quite a malevolent enterprise. So I've got no, what would you call, I have absolutely no regrets about going after the postmodern neo-Marxists as hard as I possibly can, and I'm certainly not done doing so. So one of the things that's going to happen, for example, in the next month or so, I've been working with a programmer who's volunteered his services and has already produced this. He's produced a website that enables people to enter text that will then classify the text as postmodern or non-postmodern. And so you'll be able to enter course descriptions from universities, the course description, the professor's name, the discipline, and the university. It will tell you the degree to which the description is postmodern, and then you can decide for yourself whether you want to take that and become a social justice warrior, if that's what you think your education should be about, or if you should avoid that like the plague that it truly is. And so my goal, if I had to set a personal goal, and this is the sort of thing maybe that you guys are helping me do with my continued support on Patreon, is that I'd like to knock enrollment in the postmodern disciplines down by 75% over the next 5 years. I'm thinking about it from the perspective of nonviolent warfare. It's that serious to me, and that this would be equivalent to cutting off the supply chain. It's like the postmodernists need a continual influx of young, impressionable minds in order to continue their propagandistic and society-devouring efforts, and I'm going to do absolutely everything I can to cut that supply chain off at the source. And then the human part of them goes, okay, well, what am I supposed to do next then, since there's an infinite number of choices? And the postmodernist says, well, my theory can't account for that. And then they say, well, back to Marxism. And so that's why I think there's this unholy alliance between the postmodernists and the neo-Marxists. It's because postmodernism is a dead end from the perspective of applicable wisdom. It leaves you bereft and nihilistic. And that's not good, because people can't exist without a purpose. And so they sneak the Marxism through the back door and jump into this power landscape for the reasons that we discussed earlier. So
you really think that it's because of an infinite number of possibilities interpreting things? Because I've always felt that it was really just a response to capitalism. They feel that capitalism is a very negative aspect of our culture and society, and that there's got to be some sort of an alternative. Marxism is a clearly defined alternative that other people have subscribed to in the past. You could point to it. It's a structure that's already set up, and it's romanticized. And I think they adopted for that reason, because it has the socialist aspects attached to it, and they looked at socialism as it's some sort of a thing that it regards equality, and it's some sort of an egalitarian approach.
Well, it's okay. So we'd have to take two things apart. We'd have to take Marxism / Marxism and postmodernism apart. So we could do that historically, and I would say that although there is a reason for postmodernism, which is the reason we just discussed, that the landscape, the infinite landscape of interpretation problem. It's a real problem. If you look at it historically, postmodernism actually grew out of Marxism. And so what happened is that the Marxists laid out their theory about the human social environment being composed of a power struggle between the privileged and the underprivileged, right? The rich and the poor in its initial phases. And that's a story that's partially true, and it's got a lot of motive power. Like, the motive power is the romantic motive power that you just described. I get to be on the side of the oppressed. I get to be a warrior for what's right. There's the resentment element, which is, that son of a bitch has more than me, so let's cut him off at the knees, which manifested itself brutally in the Soviet Union. And then there's the ideological totality issue, which gives people a sense of security. That took a vicious hit by the late 1960s, because the murderousness of Marxism had been clearly laid out as a doctrine. And that opened the door to this move by mostly French intellectuals to develop the postmodern philosophy, which has these advantages which we described, but also to use that as a a screening tactic for allowing Marxism to transform into identity politics. And so, like, it's hard to disentangle all the motivations that are going on in there, but there's something about it that's truly intellectually pathological, because you don't get to be a postmodernist and a Marxist. You actually technically cannot be both of those things at the same time. And the fact that most people are both of those things at the same time raises the specter of just exactly what their motivation is. To provide a snapshot, a relatively accurate but low resolution snapshot of a certain kind of war of ideas that's currently going on in our culture, and that's primarily centered in the universities. And I don't think my assessment of postmodernism and its relationship with neo-Marxism is unfair in the least. In fact, I think that the danger that's presented by that combination of, realize, for example, that the law schools had turned into training grounds for social justice activists. I didn't realize that the legal training system had become corrupt, perhaps not to the same degrees as, say, the faculties of education or social work, but it's certainly a long ways down that road. And so I do believe that postmodernism is an intellectually bankrupt school of thought. Ideological presumptions is more dangerous than people are currently aware of, and that it poses a larger threat to the integrity of our culture than I've currently stated. It's more widespread than I thought. For example, when I first started speaking out against postmodernism and neo-Marxism, some people have criticized my portrayal of postmodernism. In what ways would you claim you are fair or unfair in your assessment of its core principles? I think I'm unfair in that any rather truncated criticism of a large body of thought is liable to clip a few corners. But I would say that I'm attempting, and I believe that its alliance with neo-Marxism borders on malevolent, and it may even go past the border into actual malevolence, because I don't understand how anybody with an inkling of historical sense can take a look at the 20th century and then dare put forward ideas that are derived from Marxism as a treatment for any of society's hypothetical